The silence that never ends. Like, comment, subscribe. Because some stories don't just stay on screen, they follow you into the dark. The alarm at Goulburn Supermax did not scream. It pulsed. A low, controlled thrum spread through the concrete corridors at 3:17 a.m., vibrating through steel doors and reinforced glass like a distant heartbeat. In a prison designed to contain the most dangerous men in Australia, even emergencies were engineered to sound calm. Panic was a luxury no one inside these walls was allowed to have. Officer Daniel Mercer was halfway through a routine check when the signal hit his wrist console. Sector D, Long-Term Confinement Wing. Cell D14. Code Gray. Unresponsive inmate. Mercer had worked Goulburn for 11 years. He knew what Code Gray usually meant. Hunger strikes. Psychological shutdowns. Sometimes self-harm attempts that were quiet enough to escape the cameras for a few minutes too long. Still, something about D14 made his steps slow. The man inside that cell, Aaron Crow, had not spoken a full sentence in over 6 months. By the time Mercer reached the observation window, medical staff were already there, their faces pale under the harsh fluorescent lights. The cell door stood open, a rare sight in Supermax. Inside, Crow sat on the edge of his concrete bed, upright, hands resting neatly on his knees. He was breathing. He was awake, but his eyes were fixed on the far wall, unblinking, as if he were staring through it, past the prison, past the world. On the wall in front of him, carved deep into the concrete with what looked like a shard of metal, were 5 words. IT never lets you go. Crow didn't resist when they approached. He didn't react when they touched him. As they guided him out of the cell, Mercer noticed something that made his stomach turn. Crow was smiling. By sunrise, the prison administration had labeled the incident a psychological episode. Another data point in the long list of mental health crises associated with extended isolation. The words on the wall were scrubbed clean before breakfast. Reports were filed. Protocols were followed. And the prison went back to silence. But silence at Goulburn Supermax was never empty. The facility sat on the outskirts of New South Wales, surrounded by layers of fencing, motion sensors, and open land designed to expose anyone foolish enough to try escaping. From above, it looked less like a prison and more like a military installation. Angular, deliberate, built to intimidate. Inside, it was something else entirely. Goulburn Supermax was not about punishment in the traditional sense. It was about control. Total, unbroken, long-term control. Inmates spent up to 23 hours a day alone in cells designed to remove stimulation. Neutral colors, no sharp edges. No shadows deep enough to hide contraband or secrets. Time itself behaved differently there. For prisoners serving indefinite or life sentences, days blurred into an endless loop of routines that never changed. Lights on. Meals through a slot. 1 hour alone in an exercise yard the size of a parking space. No physical contact. No shared airspace. Conversations reduced to shouted fragments through steel. The system was designed to prevent violence by eliminating opportunity. What it rarely discussed was what happened when opportunity disappeared for years. Dr. Elena Walsh knew this better than most. As a forensic psychologist contracted by the Department of Corrections, Walsh had evaluated dozens of Supermax inmates over the years. She believed in accountability. She believed in public safety. But she also believed the human brain was not built for permanent isolation. When she was called in to assess Aaron Crow, she expected resistance. She got indifference. Crow sat across from her in the interview room, shackled, his movements slow and precise. He answered questions politely, but without emotion. When Walsh asked about the words carved into his cell wall, he tilted his head, as if the memory belonged to someone else. "I was just making space," he said. "Space for what?" Walsh asked. Crow looked at her, then really looked at her, and something flickered behind his eyes. For the noise to stop. That answer stayed with Walsh long after the interview ended. Crow had been sentenced to life for a violent armed robbery that left 2 people dead. The crime was brutal. There was no question about his guilt. What unsettled Walsh was not who Crow had been, but who he was becoming. She began reviewing his confinement records. 10 years in Supermax. No disciplinary write-ups in the last 4. No recorded incidents of aggression. No requests for additional privileges. No social interactions beyond mandatory staff contact. On paper, Crow was a model inmate. In reality, he was disappearing. Walsh wasn't the only one noticing patterns. In the months leading up to the incident in D14, several long-term inmates had begun exhibiting similar behaviors. Withdrawal, reduced speech, fixations on routine. Officers reported prisoners standing motionless for hours, tracking invisible rhythms only they could hear. One guard described it as watching someone slowly turn the volume down on themselves. Then came the maintenance logs. A junior engineer flagged an anomaly during a routine audit of the Supermax wing's infrastructure. Sensors in several cells had recorded unusual activity. Nothing dramatic, just micro-fluctuations in movement patterns. Inmates shifting at the exact same times each day, standing at the same angle, facing the same walls. Perfect consistency. Too perfect. When the engineer brought it up to his supervisor, he was told to focus on mechanical issues. Human behavior wasn't his department. But the data kept coming. Walsh requested permission to expand her evaluations beyond Crow. The request was denied. Supermax resources were limited, and administration was wary of anything that could raise questions about the ethics of long-term isolation. Goulburn's reputation mattered. The prison was often cited as a necessary extreme, a place for inmates deemed too dangerous to house anywhere else. Any suggestion that the environment itself might be causing harm was politically inconvenient. So the silence continued. Until it didn't. 3 weeks after Crow's episode, another inmate, Lucas Fenner, confined for over 12 years, was found standing in his cell, arms raised, whispering numbers under his breath. When asked what the numbers meant, Fenner replied, "They're the days I've already lived." Medical staff diagnosed acute dissociation. 2 days later, an officer in the same wing resigned without notice. He left behind his badge and a single handwritten note. You don't hear it at first. Then you can't hear anything else. Administration tightened protocols. Staff rotations increased. Observation schedules were randomized. If something was spreading, they intended to disrupt it. But disruption only made things worse. Inmates began reacting to changes with visible distress. Routines were all they had left. When the system took even that away, cracks formed fast. Walsh pushed harder. She contacted an old colleague in Sydney, shared anonymized notes, asked the question no one wanted to answer out loud. What if the danger at Goulburn Supermax wasn't the inmates? What if it was the confinement itself? The response, she got chilled. If you prove that, you won't change the prison. You'll just prove how much damage we're willing to ignore. The night everything broke, Walsh was reviewing footage from Crow's wing. Nothing dramatic. No violence. No escape attempt. Just hours of stillness. Then she noticed something new. Crow wasn't facing the wall anymore. He was facing the camera, staring directly into it, as if he knew someone somewhere was finally watching. At exactly 2:59 a.m., every inmate in Sector D sat up in their beds at the same time. No alarm, no announcement, just movement. Walsh felt her breath catch as the timestamp rolled forward. The prisoners stood, slowly, in unison. Each one turned to face the same direction, toward the central corridor, toward the heart of the prison. Security scrambled when the live feed caught it. Officers were dispatched. Medical teams alerted. The warden was called out of bed. By the time anyone reached the wing, the inmates were back on their beds, motionless, as if nothing had happened. Except for one thing. In Crow's cell, the wall had been carved again, deeper this time. It's not just me. And when the warden ordered the cell searched thoroughly, every crack, every seam, every hidden corner, they found something no one could explain. Behind a sealed maintenance panel, inaccessible from inside the cell, was a piece of folded paper. Old, yellowed, covered in handwriting that didn't match Crow's. Names. dates, and one phrase written over and over again, as if by someone counting down the end of themselves. This is what long-term confinement does. But when they traced the names, they belonged to inmates who had never shared a cell block. Some had never even been incarcerated at the same time, and one of them, according to official records, had died 15 years earlier. Locked doors, controlled silence, endless time. Goulburn Supermax was built to contain danger, but something inside its walls was growing, and no one knew how long it had been there. When control starts to slip. By dawn, Goulburn Supermax was operating under a quiet state of emergency. No sirens, no public statements, just doors that locked a little longer, guards who spoke a little less, and administrators who stopped putting anything sensitive in writing. The folded paper found behind the sealed maintenance panel was officially classified as an anomaly. Unofficially, it became an obsession. Warden Helen Price stood alone in the control room, staring at the list of names projected on the wall. Each one represented an inmate who had spent years, sometimes decades, in long-term confinement. Some had been transferred, some released into other facilities, some deceased. They had never been housed together. They should never have shared anything. And yet the handwriting analysis was clear. The same looping pressure, the same irregular spacing, the same hesitation marks, as if the writer paused often, unsure whether the next word was worth the effort. Dr. Elena Walsh was called back to the prison within hours. When she arrived, Price didn't bother with pleasantries. "This can't get out," the warden said. "Not to the media. Not to oversight. Not yet." Walsh didn't argue. She already understood the stakes. Goulburn Supermax existed in a delicate political balance, necessary, controversial, tolerated only because it promised absolute control. Any suggestion that the environment itself was influencing inmates in unpredictable ways could unravel years of policy. Still, Walsh pressed her finger against the glass, separating her from the control room screen. "These men didn't coordinate," she said, "but they synchronized. That doesn't happen by accident." Price folded her arms. "Are you saying they planned something?" "No," Walsh replied. "I'm saying they adapted to something." The investigation began quietly. Behavioral analysts pored over footage from the last 5 years, looking for patterns no one had thought to search for before. Not violence, not escape attempts, stillness, repetition, micro-behaviors that only became visible when layered on top of each other. What they found was unsettling. Inmates in long-term confinement gradually aligned their routines with the prison's internal rhythms. Ventilation cycles, lighting fluctuations, maintenance vibrations. The building itself operated on schedules invisible to anyone not forced to live inside it 23 hours a day. And over time, the inmates learned those rhythms. Not consciously, not strategically, instinctively. Walsh compared it to sailors learning the moods of the sea, or factory workers who could tell time by the hum of machines. In Goulburn, the prison never stopped speaking. It whispered in pressure changes, mechanical sighs, distant clicks behind walls. Most people filtered it out. The isolated couldn't. Aaron Crow was brought back for another evaluation. This time he spoke more. "They think isolation is empty," he said, his voice steady. "But it's full. Full of everything you're not supposed to hear." Walsh asked him about the other names. Crow frowned, genuinely puzzled. "I didn't write them all." "Then who did?" He shrugged. "People before me. People after. You leave things behind when you don't have anywhere else to put them." That answer sent a ripple through the room. Records were pulled. Maintenance logs reviewed again, this time with a different question in mind. Had there been opportunities, however brief, for messages to be hidden, panels opened, concrete patched, walls repainted? The answer was yes. Over decades, cells were refurbished, seals replaced, surfaces resurfaced. Each intervention created a moment, sometimes seconds, sometimes minutes, where the barrier between inmate and infrastructure thinned. Enough time to carve a word, enough time to fold a note, enough time to pass something forward. The realization was deeply uncomfortable. Goulburn Supermax, had been designed as a series of isolated boxes. But in practice, it functioned more like a relay, information moving slowly, imperfectly, but persistently from one confined mind to the next. Not instructions, not plans, experiences. By the end of the week, 2 more incidents occurred. Inmate Patrick Lone, silent for years, suddenly requested writing materials. When asked why, he said, "I need to finish something." Inmate Marco Diaz refused meals for 48 hours, not as a protest, but because, according to medical staff, he forgot to eat. The pressure inside the facility mounted. Staff morale dipped. Officers reported difficulty sleeping, carrying the sense of the prison's silence home with them. One described it as like the building follows you. Administration responded by increasing rotations. No guard would work the same wing for more than 2 weeks. Psychological check-ins were mandated, but the inmates remained constant, and they were changing. Walsh proposed a controversial experiment, a controlled disruption of isolation for one long-term inmate. Increased human contact, extended conversation, a temporary break in the sensory deprivation. The proposal was denied. Goulburn Supermax did not experiment on its core principle. Containment first. The breaking point came during a routine night shift. At 1:12 a.m., every motion sensor in Sector D registered movement simultaneously. Not enough to trigger alarms, just enough to register. Operators watched as inmates sat up in their beds. Again. This time, one did not lie back down. Lucas Fenner remained standing. He walked to the center of his cell, placed his palm against the wall, and spoke clearly for the first time in years. "It's time." Guards rushed the wing. When they arrived, Fenner was back in his bed, breathing normally. The wall beneath his hand was warm. Thermal imaging showed a heat pattern extending through the concrete, faint, but real, leading toward the next cell. And the next. And the next. It was impossible. Concrete didn't transmit heat like that. Not without a source. Not without power. Yet the readings were undeniable. Engineers were brought in under strict confidentiality. They found no faults, no wiring issues, no explanation. But one of them, a veteran named Simon Rourke, lingered over the data longer than the others. "This place resonates," he said quietly. "You build something this dense, this controlled, it starts behaving like an instrument." No one knew what to say to that. The next morning, Warden Price received a call from Canberra. Oversight had heard rumors, not specifics, just whispers. Unusual staff turnover. Psychological incidents clustering in one facility. Questions about long-term confinement were resurfacing in Parliament, pushed by advocacy groups who had been waiting years for leverage. Price was told politely to resolve the situation quickly. That afternoon, Dr. Walsh was informed her contract was under review. She understood the message. That night, she returned to Crow's cell one last time. "You know what's happening, don't you?" she asked. Crow considered the question. "We're not doing anything," he said. "We're just reaching the same place." "What place?" He looked at the ceiling, then back at her, where the walls stopped feeling solid. Walsh left the prison with a knot in her chest. 2 days later, the first transfer was approved. Not Crow. Fenner. Officially, it was for medical reasons. Unofficially, administration wanted to break the pattern, remove one node from the system, and see if the rest destabilized. The transfer was scheduled before dawn. Fenner complied without resistance. As officers escorted him down the corridor, he turned his head slightly and smiled. Not at them, at the walls. Within hours of his departure, the incidents escalated. 3 inmates refused to leave their beds. One began speaking in a low, rhythmic cadence, repeating a phrase no one could trace. "This is how it stays." By the end of the week, maintenance discovered new markings behind a freshly replaced panel. Same handwriting, different message. "You can move US. You can't unmake this." Warden Price finally authorized a full internal review. Too late. Because somewhere between the silence, the years, and the concrete, Goulburn Supermax had crossed a line no one had been watching. It wasn't just holding men anymore. It was shaping them. And the question no one dared ask out loud was the most dangerous one of all. What happens when the prison outlasts the people who build it? What the walls remember. By the time the oversight delegation arrived at Goulburn Supermax, the prison was already pretending nothing was wrong. Fresh coats of paint dulled the corridors. Maintenance panels were sealed with new fasteners. Shift logs were rewritten to smooth out anomalies. Every surface looked calmer, quieter, like a crime scene scrubbed too clean. But silence, once disturbed, never fully resets. Warden Helen Price stood at the front gate as the convoy rolled in. Black sedans, neutral faces, clipboards and credentials. People who believed systems could be audited the way balance sheets could, line by line, discrepancy by discrepancy, until certainty returned. They were wrong. Inside the prison, the inmates felt the change immediately. The air was different, tighter, as if the building were holding its breath. Lucas Fenner's absence had not weakened the pattern. It had clarified it. Inmates who had never spoken now timed their movements to the same internal beat. Sitting up, standing, pressing palms to walls at the same minute, the same second, across different wings. No alarms triggered. No rules were broken. Yet the synchronization was undeniable. Dr. Elena Walsh watched the feeds from a remote office miles away, having been quietly reassigned pending review. She was no longer authorized to enter the facility, but she still had access to data, an oversight no one had thought important enough to close. She noticed something the engineers hadn't. The rhythms were accelerating. What once took months now took days. The prison wasn't just influencing the men inside it. It was teaching them. The delegation's tour began with the expected talking points. Long-term confinement protocols, safety statistics, zero escapes, controlled movement, absolute containment. One official asked the obvious question: how do inmates handle the isolation? Price answered smoothly: predictability helps. Routine creates stability. From a cell deep in Sector D, Aaron Crow smiled. That night, the first incident occurred in front of witnesses. At 11:07 p.m., every light in the prison flickered, not off, not dimmed, but out of phase. A subtle stutter, like a skipped heartbeat. One of the delegates noticed. "What was that?" she asked. "Power fluctuation," Price replied instantly. But the prison systems reported no fluctuation. Minutes later, the sound began. A low vibration, barely audible, rising through the floors. The delegates felt it before they heard it, a pressure in the chest, a sense of imbalance. Engineers blamed airflow. The inmates knew better. Crow stood in his cell and spoke softly, not to the guards, not to the cameras, but to the structure itself. "You're late," he said. In the control room, Simon Rourke, pulled back and despite his earlier warnings, watched data streams collide in ways that shouldn't have been possible. Environmental controls were compensating for conditions that didn't exist. Feedback loops were forming where none had been programmed. "It's not a failure," he muttered. "It's a resonance." At 2:19 a.m., one of the delegates collapsed. Medical staff rushed in. The official regained consciousness quickly, confused, disoriented. Tests showed nothing abnormal. No toxins. No oxygen deprivation. Yet she insisted on one thing. "The walls were humming," she said. "Like they knew we were here." The investigation should have paused then. Instead, it accelerated. Pressure from Canberra mounted. Advocacy groups demanded answers. Leaks, carefully anonymized, hinted at psychological contagion within Supermax environments. The word alone was enough to spark outrage. Price was ordered to produce a definitive report. What she produced, instead, was a compromise. She acknowledged staff strain, environmental stressors, the challenges of long-term confinement. She did not mention synchronization, or messages, or heat moving through concrete. And she recommended a solution: a permanent reduction of long-term isolation. It was radical. It was political. And it was rejected. Goulburn Supermax existed to contain what could not be managed elsewhere. Softening its core principle was not an option. So a different solution was chosen. Transfers. Quiet ones. Over the next month, 7 inmates were removed from long-term confinement and dispersed across different facilities. Different states. Different security levels. The pattern should have collapsed. It didn't. Within weeks, reports came in. An inmate in Queensland began tapping his wall at precise intervals. Another in Western Australia requested a maintenance log to understand the noise. A third wrote a sentence on his cell floor before tearing it apart. The walls remember us. That was when Price understood the final, unbearable truth. This was never about Goulburn alone. The prison had not created the pattern. It had revealed it. Long-term confinement didn't erase identity. It stripped everything else away until only perception remained. And perception, left alone long enough, learned to attach itself to whatever endured. Concrete, steel, rhythm, routine. The human mind, deprived of change, bonded with permanence. By the time Price resigned, she no longer argued with the building. She simply listened. Her replacement ordered a comprehensive redesign of Sector D. Walls were reinforced. Materials changed. Ventilation reworked to disrupt resonance patterns. The cost was staggering. The results were mixed. The prison grew quieter, but it never returned to normal. Years passed. Public attention drifted. New scandals replaced old ones. Goulburn Supermax faded back into the background of national consciousness, where it was most comfortable. Dr. Walsh published nothing. Her notes remained locked behind non-disclosure agreements that would outlive her. Simon Rourke retired early. On his last day, he left behind a personal file on a secure server, labeled simply, Emergent Behavior. It was never opened. A decade later, a junior corrections officer, new curious, not yet worn down by routine, noticed something during a night shift. At exactly 3:14 a.m., inmates across 3 wings adjusted their posture. Nothing dramatic, just a shift, a breath, a collective stillness. The officer reported it. The report was archived. No action was taken, because Goulburn Supermax was still functioning, still secure, still escape-proof. And that, officially, was all that mattered. But those who had been inside, staff and inmates alike, knew better. The prison did not break men. It absorbed them, layer by layer, year by year, until the difference between the walls and what they contained became harder to define. Some say long-term confinement is about removing freedom. Others say it's about control. Goulburn Supermax proved something far more unsettling. That when you lock human beings away long enough, the prison doesn't just hold them. It learns from them. And if you think that's where this story ends, you might want to stay right here. Because the next one asks an even darker question. What happens when the walls start answering back? Hit subscribe, stay curious, and don't miss what comes next.